husband walked out calling me worthless incubator while I was pregnant. Now he needs my signature for his inheritance. I was 6 months pregnant when Brett came home and said he needed to talk. Not about baby names or the nursery we'd been planning. He'd met someone at his CrossFit gym. Said she made him feel alive again and that I'd let myself go. I was literally growing his child and he said I'd gotten lazy and boring. Called me a worthless incubator who trapped him with a baby. Then he packed his stuff and left. Just like that. 5 years of marriage gone because some 22-year-old at the gym told him he deserved better. He blocked my number before he even pulled out of the driveway. His mom called the next day, asking what I did to make him leave. Not checking if I was okay, just assuming I'd done something wrong. When I told her he left me for another woman, she said maybe I should have tried harder to keep his interest. His whole family unfriended me online that same week. I had to handle everything alone. Every doctor appointment, every birthing class, every middle of the night panic about being a single mom. Brett never asked about the baby, never sent money, nothing. I paid for everything myself while working until the day I went into labor. When our daughter Haley was born, I texted him from one of my friend's phones. He responded, saying he wasn't ready to be tied down and I should handle it. That's it. No questions about her health, her name, nothing. My brother had to drive me home from the hospital because Brett was too busy with his new life. For 2 years, I raised Haley alone. He never paid child support because he'd quit his corporate job to become a personal trainer at his girlfriend's daddy's gym. Cash only, no official income to report. I worked from home doing data entry while taking care of a baby. Brett was living in his girlfriend's condo, posting gym selfies and vacation photos. Never once asked about Haley. His family acted like she didn't exist. Then his girlfriend's dad sold the gym and fired him. She dumped him the same week and suddenly Brett remembered he had a family. He showed up at my door at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday with a duffel bag. Said he was ready to come home and be a father now. Like he'd been away on a business trip or something. I laughed and tried to close the door, but he pushed his way in. Started talking about how we could make it work, how he'd grown as a person, how he missed what we had. Never apologized for leaving. Never mentioned the horrible things he said. Never asked about what we'd been through. He actually went to the kitchen and started making himself a sandwich with my food. Said he'd sleep on the couch until I was ready to let him back in the bedroom. I told him to leave and he said I couldn't kick him out because his name was still on the lease. He'd been thinking about coming back, so he never took himself off it. The landlord confirmed Brett had the right to stay. So this man who abandoned his pregnant wife moved into my living room like a squatter. He'd eat my food, use my stuff, leave his gym clothes everywhere. When Haley woke up crying, he'd complain about the noise. Never offered to help, just complained. His mom started calling again, saying how wonderful it was that Brett was giving me another chance, that I should be grateful he came back at all. She actually said most men wouldn't return to a woman who'd gained baby weight. I hadn't even gained that much weight, but apparently existing as a normal postpartum woman was offensive to their family. Brett started bringing dates to the apartment. Said since we weren't together, he could do what he wanted in his own home. These random women would be in my kitchen at breakfast while I'm trying to feed Haley. One of them asked if I was the nanny. Brett didn't correct her. After 3 weeks of this, Brett's dad died. Turns out he'd been rich from some patents he owned. Left Brett $200,000 but with one condition. Brett had to be legally married to receive it. Guess who was still legally married to Brett because he'd abandoned the divorce papers I'd sent him? Suddenly Brett was super interested in being a husband again. Brought flowers, ordered takeout, said we should work things out for Haley's sake. When I said no, he got nasty. Said no judge would give a broke single mom full custody when he was about to have money. Said he'd take Haley just to spite me if I didn't cooperate. That's when I played my cards. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder I'd been building since the day he walked back into my life. Screenshots of every text message he'd sent from that burner number. Photos of the dates he'd brought home. A spreadsheet tracking every dollar I'd spent on Haley while he posted vacation pictures online. Brett's face went from smug to pale in about 3 seconds. I showed him the text he'd sent when Haley was born, the one where he said he wasn't ready to be tied down. Showed him the witness statements from my neighbors who'd seen him bring different women into my apartment while his 2-year-old daughter slept in the next room. Showed him the bank records proving he'd contributed exactly $0 to raising his child. He tried to grab my phone, but I pulled it back and reminded him that everything was backed up in 3 different places. His hands were shaking a little bit now, and that felt good. Brett let out this fake laugh that didn't match his eyes and said none of it mattered because we were still married and he had rights as a father. I sat down on the couch and looked right at him while I explained that I'd already talked to Lydia Vasquez, a family law attorney who specialized in abandonment cases. She'd reviewed everything I had and told me it was one of the strongest cases she'd seen in 15 years of practice. Brett's lawyer face crumbled and he started pacing around my living room like a trapped animal. He kept running his hands through his hair and I could see him trying to figure out how this had gone so wrong for him. The man who'd called me worthless was realizing I'd been 3 steps ahead of him the whole time. His whole attitude changed right there in front of me. Suddenly he wanted to talk things through like reasonable adults. Said we could work something out that benefited both of us. Maybe split the inheritance 50-50, and work out a custody arrangement that gave us equal time with Haley. He actually used the word partnership like we were business associates instead of a man who'd abandoned his pregnant wife. I watched him try to smile at me the way he used to when he wanted something, and it made my skin crawl. This was the same person who'd blocked my number before he even left the driveway, who'd ignored every update about his daughter's first 2 years of life. Now he wanted to negotiate because he finally understood I had power. I told him exactly what I wanted and didn't sugarcoat any of it. Full custody with him getting supervised visitation if he completed parenting classes and proved he could be consistent. Every single penny of child support he owed for the past 2 years, calculated at his old corporate salary since he'd deliberately hidden income. A fair division of the inheritance since we were legally married when his father died. Brett's eyes went wide and I could actually see him doing math in his head. 2 years of child support at his old salary would be around $40,000. Add in legal fees and half the inheritance, and he was looking at walking away with maybe $60,000 or $70,000 instead of the full $200,000. His jaw clenched and he asked if I was trying to punish him. I said no. I was trying to get what Haley deserved from the father who'd pretended she didn't exist. That's when he got nasty again. Said he'd fight me for custody out of pure spite, drag this through court for years until I was completely broken. Threatened to tell the judge I was an unfit mother who kept his daughter from him, that I'd poisoned Haley against her own father. I let him finish his little rant, and then pulled up more files on my phone. Voice recordings of him complaining about Haley crying at night, saying she was ruining his sleep and he couldn't wait to move out again. Text messages to his gym buddies calling her a mistake and saying he should have pushed harder for me to terminate the pregnancy. Photos Kaya had taken of him making out with some woman on my couch, while Haley's toys were scattered on the floor 3 feet away. I asked him how he thought that would play in front of a family court judge. The next morning my phone rang at 7, and it was Brett's mom. She didn't even say hello, just launched right into demanding to know what I was doing to her son. Said I was being vindictive and cruel, trying to keep Brett from his rightful inheritance over some petty grudge. Asked how I could be so heartless when Brett's father had just died and he was grieving. I switched the phone to speaker and kept making Haley's breakfast while she talked. She went on about how Brett had made mistakes, but he was trying to make things right, and I was punishing him for being human. Never once asked about Haley, or acknowledged that her son had abandoned his pregnant wife and infant daughter. Just wanted to know why I was making things difficult for poor Brett. I waited until she ran out of steam, and then spoke in the calmest voice I could manage. Told her that Brett had walked out when I was 6 months pregnant and called me a worthless incubator. That he'd blocked my number and refused to help with anything related to Haley for 2 solid years. That he'd never sent money, never asked about doctor appointments or milestones, never even asked what we named his daughter. That he'd only come back when he needed my signature for money, and had been bringing dates into my home while his toddler daughter was here. She went completely silent on the other end. Then she said in this cold voice that I must have done something to deserve it. That good men didn't just leave for no reason. Said maybe if I'd been a better wife, Brett wouldn't have needed to find happiness elsewhere. Then she hung up on me before I could respond. Kaya showed up that afternoon with 2 bags of groceries and a determined look on her face. She'd been my neighbor since before Haley was born and had watched the whole situation unfold. Put the groceries away while I got Haley settled with her blocks, and then sat down at my kitchen table with a notebook. Said she'd been keeping detailed notes every time Brett brought a woman home, including dates and times and descriptions. Had written down every complaint he'd made about Haley crying or needing things, every time he'd eaten my food, or used my stuff without asking. She'd even taken photos of his dates' cars in the parking lot as proof of the timeline. Told me she'd testify in court if I needed her to, that she was sick of watching him treat me and Haley like we were nothing. I hugged her and tried not to cry because having someone actually believe me and support me felt overwhelming after years of doing everything alone. At Lydia's office, I spread everything out on her conference table. 2 years' worth of documentation showing exactly what kind of father Brett had been. The text from when Haley was born where he said I should handle it. Screenshots of his social media posts from expensive vacations while I was buying diapers with spare change. Witness statements from Kaya and my brother and the neighbors who'd seen him abandon us. Bank records proving 0 child support payments despite him working and earning money. Lydia went through it all methodically, making notes and organizing things into folders. When she finished, she looked up at me and said, this was one of the strongest abandonment cases she'd ever seen. Said Brett's own words admitting he wasn't ready to be a father would destroy any custody claim he tried to make. She explained that Brett's threats were completely empty. No judge would give significant custody to a father who'd voluntarily abandoned his child for 2 years and only returned when he needed something. His credibility was shot before he even walked into a courtroom. The documentation I had would prove a pattern of neglect and self-interest that made him look terrible. Add in the witnesses willing to testify about him bringing dates around Haley and complaining about basic parenting responsibilities, and he had no case at all. Lydia said we could push for full legal and physical custody with him getting only supervised visitation, and we'd probably win without much fight. Said the child support claim was solid too, since he'd been working and deliberately hiding income. Brett had backed himself into a corner, and the only way out was going to cost him a lot of money. I left Lydia's office with a folder full of paperwork and a plan that felt solid for the first time in years. She'd laid out everything in terms even someone as exhausted as me could understand. Full custody wasn't just possible, it was likely. Back child support wasn't just fair, it was enforceable. And half the inheritance wasn't greedy. It was my legal right as his wife. Brett had trapped himself by staying married to me, and now that trap was going to cost him everything he thought he'd won. The drive home felt different. I wasn't scared anymore. I wasn't second-guessing myself or wondering if I was being too harsh. Brett had made his choices, and now I was making mine. Haley was asleep in her car seat, her little hand clutching the stuffed rabbit she took everywhere. She deserved better than a father who only showed up when he needed something. She deserved stability and security and a parent who put her first. I was going to make sure she got that, no matter what Brett tried to pull. When I unlocked the apartment door, Brett was sprawled across my couch with his feet on my coffee table, eating chips straight from the bag and watching some action movie at full volume. He didn't even look up when I came in, just kept shoving chips in his mouth like he owned the place. I set Haley's carrier down gently in the corner and pulled the divorce papers from my bag. My hands weren't shaking. I walked over and stood between him and the TV until he had no choice but to acknowledge me. He looked annoyed at first, like I was interrupting something important. Then I held out the papers and his expression changed. He took them from me without saying anything and started reading. I watched his face go from confused to shocked to angry in about 30 seconds. His jaw clenched. His neck turned red. He flipped through the pages faster and faster, and I could see the exact moment he understood what he was looking at. Full custody. 2 years of back support calculated at his old corporate salary, not his fake trainer income, and half of his daddy's money that he'd been counting on to fund his new life. Brett jumped off the couch so fast he knocked the chip bag onto the floor. He was yelling before he even fully stood up, waving the papers in my face and saying I couldn't do this, that I didn't earn his inheritance and I had no right to take it, that his father left that money to him, not me. I stayed calm, which seemed to make him even madder. I pointed out that we were legally married, which made it marital property under state law, that his father's will requiring him to be married actually worked in my favor now, that he'd been so busy trying to use our marriage as leverage that he'd forgotten I could do the same thing. He threatened to refuse to sign anything, said he'd drag this out in court for years if he had to, that he'd make my life so difficult I'd give up and settle for whatever he offered. I reminded him that he couldn't access the inheritance without being married and I was the only wife he had, that every day he delayed was another day without his money, that he was trapped by the same situation he'd tried to use against me, and the only way out was going to cost him more than he wanted to pay. Brett's face went from red to purple. He threw the papers on the floor and stormed toward the door, already pulling out his phone. I heard him in the hallway, his voice loud and angry as he presumably called Owen. I picked up the papers, smoothed them out, and put them back in the folder. Then I got Haley out of her carrier and started making her dinner like nothing had happened. Mac and cheese, her favorite. She babbled at me while I stirred the pot, completely unaware that her father was outside losing his mind over paperwork that was going to change all our lives. After dinner, I gave Haley her bath, let her play with her bath toys until the water got cold, then got her into pajamas and read her 3 books before bed. The whole time I felt calmer than I had in weeks. I had a real plan now. Documentation that proved everything. A lawyer who knew what she was doing, and leverage that Brett couldn't get around no matter how much he yelled or threatened. He'd spent 2 years thinking he held all the cards, but he'd been wrong. I'd been building my case the whole time, and now it was strong enough to protect both me and Haley from whatever he tried next. The next day my phone rang while I was working. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. A man's voice introduced himself as Owen and said he was calling on Brett's behalf. He had that smooth lawyer tone that was probably supposed to make me feel intimidated, like I was out of my depth. He suggested we could settle this quickly and reasonably without involving the courts. Said Brett was willing to be generous if I was willing to be flexible. I told him to talk to Lydia and hung up before he could finish his sentence. I wasn't going to let some lawyer bully me into accepting less than what was fair, and I definitely wasn't going to negotiate without my own representation present. Brett came home that night looking completely different from the angry man who'd stormed out the day before. His shoulders were slumped. His face was tired. He asked if we could talk like adults, using this reasonable voice that I immediately didn't trust. I agreed, but pulled out my phone and started recording before he even sat down. It's legal in our state to record conversations you're part of, and I wasn't about to have another situation where it was his word against mine. He noticed the phone but didn't object, which told me Owen had probably warned him about making things worse. He offered me $50,000 and joint custody if I signed off on the divorce quickly. Just like that, like it was a generous compromise instead of an insult. I actually laughed, which seemed to surprise him. I told him that wasn't even close to what I was owed, and joint custody definitely wasn't happening after he'd abandoned Haley for 2 years. That he couldn't just throw money at the problem and expect me to forget everything he'd done. That our daughter deserved better than a part-time father who only showed up when it was convenient. Brett switched tactics, trying the sympathy approach. Said he was young and scared when I got pregnant. That he'd made mistakes, but he wanted to be a father now. That he'd grown up and learned from his errors. I asked him where this sudden desire to be a father had been during Haley's first steps, during her first words, during every middle of the night fever and every doctor visit and every milestone he'd missed because he was too busy posting gym selfies with his girlfriend. He didn't have an answer for that. He admitted he messed up, but said I was being cruel by keeping him from his daughter, that Haley needed her father and I was using her as a weapon to punish him. I told him he'd kept himself away by his own choices, that he'd had 2 years to reach out, to ask about her, to send even a single dollar to help support her, that he'd chosen his girlfriend and his new life over his family, and now he had to face the consequences of abandoning us when we needed him most, that this wasn't about punishment, it was about protection. Protecting Haley from someone who'd already proven he'd walk away the second things got hard, that this wasn't about revenge or being mean, that this was about making sure Haley had a stable life with a parent who wouldn't disappear the second things got hard again. Brett stood up and left without another word. I heard the front door close and felt relief wash over me. For the first time since he'd shown up, I had real hope that this nightmare might actually end. Brett showed up the next morning with roses and a bag from the bakery down the street. He set them on the kitchen counter while I was feeding Haley breakfast. She looked at him like he was a stranger, which he was. He tried to smile at her, but it came out weird and forced. I told him the flowers and pastries weren't going to change anything. He said he knew that, but wanted to show he was trying. I reminded him that trying meant actions over time, not grand gestures when he wanted something. He nodded and asked if he could stay for breakfast. I said no. Haley needed routine and stability, not some random man showing up and confusing her. He looked hurt, but left without arguing. That afternoon, he texted asking if he could take us to dinner. I didn't respond. The next day, he offered to cook dinner at the apartment. I told him we already had plans. On Thursday, he brought toys for Haley. Expensive stuff from the fancy toy store downtown. She took one look at him and started crying. Reached for me and buried her face in my shoulder. Brett tried to hand her a stuffed animal, but she cried harder. I saw something cross his face. Shame, maybe. Or guilt. But then his jaw tightened and he got defensive. Said she was just tired and needed time to warm up to him. I told him she didn't know who he was because he'd never been around. That 2 years of absence couldn't be fixed with toys and forced smiles. That she was scared of him because he was a stranger to her. Brett set the toys down and walked out. Came back an hour later and tried again. Haley cried every time he got close. By Sunday, he'd tried 6 different approaches. Flowers, food, toys, offers to help around the apartment. Nothing worked. Haley wanted nothing to do with him, and I wasn't going to force her to accept him just to make him feel better about abandoning her. Monday morning, my phone rang while I was doing laundry. Lydia's name showed on the screen. She said Dave Solomon wanted to meet with both of us. Dave was the estate attorney handling Brett's dad's will. Apparently, there was specific language in the will about the marriage requirement that might work in our favor even more than we thought. She said Dave had some discretion as executor and wanted to discuss the situation. We scheduled the meeting for Wednesday afternoon. I arranged for Kaya to watch Haley. Brett texted asking what the meeting was about. I told him to ask his lawyer. When Wednesday came, I drove to Dave's office downtown. Brett and Owen were already in the waiting room. Brett looked nervous. Owen looked calm and professional like always. The secretary led us to a conference room. Dave was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and reading glasses. He shook everyone's hands and gestured for us to sit. Dave opened a folder and pulled out several pages. He explained that Brett's father had very specific requirements for the inheritance. Not just that Brett had to be married, but that the marriage had to be stable and ongoing. The will mentioned demonstrating commitment to family. Words like responsibility and dedication appeared multiple times. Dave looked at Brett and said the language suggested his father wanted to ensure Brett was a responsible family man before giving him access to that much money. Brett shifted in his chair. Dave continued reading sections of the will out loud. Every part emphasized family commitment and stability. Nothing about just being technically married on paper. Dave set the papers down and looked directly at Brett. He said that as executor, he had discretion to determine whether Brett actually met the requirements his father set out. That the will wasn't just about marital status, but about character and commitment. Dave said he'd been doing research since Owen first contacted him, found out about the separation and abandonment, about Haley being born while Brett was living with another woman, about 2 years of zero contact and zero support. Dave folded his hands on the table. He said given all that information, he was inclined to rule that Brett didn't qualify for the inheritance at all. That abandoning a pregnant wife was the exact opposite of what his father intended when he wrote those requirements. Brett's face went white. He started talking fast, saying his father didn't know about any separation, that they'd kept it private, that his dad died thinking everything was fine. Dave cut him off, said it didn't matter what his father knew or didn't know. What mattered was the intent behind the will. The requirements were clear: stable marriage, family commitment, responsibility. Brett had demonstrated none of those things. Dave said the whole point was to make sure Brett was a good husband and father before giving him money. Walking out on a pregnant wife showed he was neither. I watched Brett's whole plan collapse right in front of him. His face changed from white to red. His hands gripped the edge of the table. Owen put a hand on his arm, but Brett shook it off. He started arguing that this wasn't fair, that his father would have wanted him to have the money, that Dave was interpreting the will wrong. Dave stayed calm, said his interpretation was well within his authority as executor, that if Brett wanted to challenge it, he could take it to probate court. But that would take months and cost tens of thousands in legal fees, money Brett didn't have. And even then, a judge would likely agree that Brett's actions showed a complete lack of family commitment. Brett slumped back in his chair. I could see him doing the math. No inheritance, child support payments, legal fees. He'd end up with nothing or worse than nothing. Dave suggested a compromise, said Brett could still access the inheritance if he agreed to my terms, and demonstrated genuine commitment to supporting Haley going forward. Not just signing papers, but actually following through. Paying support on time, being present in Haley's life in a healthy way, completing parenting classes. Dave said this wasn't about punishing Brett. It was about making sure he took responsibility like his father wanted, that the money would be released once Brett proved he was serious about being a father instead of just wanting cash. Owen asked for a private conversation with Brett. They went to a smaller office down the hall. Through the glass door, I could see Brett getting more and more worked up. His hands moved around. His face got red again. Owen stayed calm, probably explaining how badly Brett had messed up by trying to manipulate everything, how he'd backed himself into a corner with no good options. They talked for maybe 15 minutes. When they came back, Owen did the talking. He said Brett was willing to accept my original terms with one change. He wanted scheduled visitation with Haley once the divorce was final, starting with supervised visits to build a relationship slowly, gradually increasing time if things went well. He said Brett understood he couldn't just show up and be a father overnight, that he needed to earn Haley's trust and prove himself. I looked at Lydia. She nodded slightly. I told them I'd consider supervised visitation only after Brett completed parenting classes and paid the first 6 months of child support up front. If he was serious about being a father, he could prove it with actions. Not promises, not flowers or toys. Real actions that showed commitment. Brett looked at Owen. Owen looked at Dave. Dave said that sounded reasonable and would satisfy the will's requirements if Brett followed through. Brett closed his eyes for a second, then nodded. Said fine. He'd do it. Owen pulled out his laptop and started typing. Brett sat with his arms crossed, staring at the table while the keys clicked. I watched Owen's face as he worked through each section, checking details with Dave and Lydia. The custody arrangement, the support payments, the inheritance split. Every few minutes, Owen would read a line out loud, and Brett would nod without looking up. His whole body looked tight, like he was holding himself together by force. Dave leaned over to review what Owen was writing and made a few suggestions about the language. Lydia did the same from my side, her pen marking notes on her own copy. The whole process took maybe 20 minutes, but it felt longer. Nobody talked except to clarify legal terms. When Owen finished, he printed 4 copies and passed them around the table. I read through mine carefully, checking every word. Full legal and physical custody to me. 2 years of back child support calculated at Brett's old salary, which came out to way more than I expected. 40% of the $200,000 inheritance. A visitation schedule that started with supervised visits twice a month and could increase based on how things went with Haley. Brett had to complete parenting classes before any unsupervised time. Lydia picked up her pen and added something at the bottom. She wrote that if Brett missed any child support payment or broke any part of the custody rules, he'd lose all visitation rights forever and owe extra money as punishment. She showed it to Dave, who nodded and added it to his copy. Owen read it and looked at Brett, who just shrugged and looked away. We all signed. My hand was steady when I wrote my name. Brett's hand shook a little when he signed his. Dave collected the papers and said he'd hold the inheritance money until the divorce was final, and Brett made his first support payment. Brett pulled out his checkbook right there at the table. He wrote a check for 6 months of support, his pen pressing hard into the paper. He ripped it out and handed it to me without making eye contact. I folded it and put it in my purse. Walking out of Dave's office, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. The air outside was cool and the sun was starting to set. My car was parked 3 rows away from Brett's truck. He followed me across the parking lot, calling my name. I turned around and held up my hand. All communication goes through our lawyers now. He needed to be out of my apartment in 48 hours like the agreement said. He opened his mouth to argue, but I was already walking away. I got in my car and locked the doors before he could say anything else. The next day, I went to work like normal. Kaya came over to watch Haley around 9 in the morning. She texted me at lunch saying Brett had shown up with boxes and garbage bags. He took his clothes, his gym equipment, the gaming system he'd bought with my money. He didn't say anything to Kaya or try to see Haley, just loaded his truck and left. When I got home that evening, his key was sitting on the kitchen counter next to a coffee ring. No note, no apology, just the key. I picked it up and called Wesley right away. He said he could come by the next morning to change the locks and get the paperwork done to remove Brett's name from the lease. I also called my credit card company and changed all my passwords that night. Brett knew too much about my accounts and I didn't trust him not to try something. 6 weeks later, I stood in the courthouse hallway with Lydia. Brett and Owen were on the other side. maybe 30 feet away. We didn't look at each other. The judge called us in, and we sat on opposite sides of the courtroom. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. The judge reviewed the settlement agreement, asked if we both understood and agreed to the terms, and signed the papers. That was it. I was officially divorced. Walking out, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not happy exactly, but free. Like I could finally move forward instead of being stuck in the mess Brett created. Brett's check cleared 3 days after the divorce was final. I logged into my bank account and saw the deposit. 6 months of child support. More money than I'd seen at once since before Haley was born. I paid off my credit card that same day. The balance had been climbing for 2 years. Every emergency and unexpected cost adding up because I had no other option. Seeing that zero balance felt amazing. The rest of the money went into 2 accounts. One for Haley's future, college, or whatever she needed when she got older. One for emergencies so I'd never feel trapped again. I could handle an unexpected car repair or medical bill without panic. I could breathe. 2 weeks later, Brett showed up for his first supervised visit at the family center across town. I drove Haley there and checked in with the supervisor, a woman named Sandra, who explained how everything worked. There was a playroom with toys and books where Brett and Haley would spend an hour together. I could watch through a one-way mirror in the next room. Haley held my hand tight when we walked in. She didn't know Brett at all. He was just some man who sometimes showed up and tried to talk to her. He'd brought a stuffed elephant and some blocks. Sandra introduced them and suggested they play together. I went to the observation room and sat down. Through the glass, I watched Brett kneel on the floor next to Haley. He showed her the elephant and she reached for it carefully. He tried to stack blocks with her, but she knocked them down instead. He looked nervous, his movements stiff and awkward. He kept glancing at Sandra like he needed permission for everything. Haley warmed up slowly, playing near him but not really with him. By the end of the hour, she was showing him her favorite book, pointing at the pictures. Brett read it to her in a quiet voice I could barely hear through the glass. When the visit ended, Sandra walked me back to the playroom. She said Brett seemed genuinely nervous and tried his best, though he clearly had no idea how to interact with a toddler. Every time Haley moved away from him, he'd panic a little. Every time she smiled at him, he'd relax. Sandra recommended he continue supervised visits for at least 3 months before we considered any changes. He needed to build trust with Haley slowly. I agreed. This wasn't about Brett getting what he wanted. This was about Haley having a chance to know her father if he could actually show up and be consistent. I enrolled Haley in a better daycare the next week. The old one was fine, but this new place had more activities, better teachers, and a curriculum that would help her learn. I could afford it now. I also started working toward a promotion at my job. My boss had mentioned it a few months ago, but I'd been too stressed to focus on anything beyond survival. Now I could actually plan for the future. I updated my resume. I took on extra projects. I showed up to meetings with ideas instead of just trying to get through the day. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was building something. Not for Brett or anyone else. For me and Haley. For the life we deserved after everything we'd been through. Brett's mom called 3 days later. Her voice sounded different this time. Softer somehow. She said she needed to talk to me about something important. I almost hung up, but something made me wait. She started apologizing. Actually apologizing. For how she treated me when Brett left. Said she'd been thinking about everything since the divorce went through. Brett's dad had talked to her before he died. Told her he was worried about Brett's character. He'd seen the way Brett acted with money and relationships. The will wasn't just about marriage. It was about making sure Brett learned responsibility. She asked if she could meet Haley. Her only grandchild, she said. Her voice cracked when she said it. I told her I'd think about it and ended the call. I brought it up with Pearl at my next therapy session. We'd been working through everything that happened, processing the abandonment and rebuilding my ability to trust. Pearl asked what I thought about letting Brett's mom meet Haley. I said part of me wanted to say no just to hurt her back for how she hurt me. But Haley deserved to know her grandmother if she was genuinely trying to make things right. Pearl helped me see that protecting Haley didn't mean cutting her off from everyone connected to Brett. It meant setting boundaries and making sure any relationship was healthy and supervised. I decided to allow visits but separate from Brett's time. She'd have to earn trust just like he did. The first meeting happened at the family center with a supervisor present. Brett's mom showed up early, holding a wrapped present and looking nervous. When she saw Haley, she started crying. Not dramatic sobbing, just quiet tears running down her face. She knelt down to Haley's level and introduced herself as Grandma. Haley hid behind my legs at first, but eventually came out when Brett's mom showed her the present. A stuffed bunny. They sat on the floor together while Brett's mom pulled out a photo album. Pictures of Brett as a baby, as a kid, growing up. She told Haley stories about her daddy when he was little, pointing at pictures and making Haley laugh. She told me she wanted Haley to know her family history. The good parts, at least. Before she left, she hugged me and thanked me for giving her this chance. Said she knew she didn't deserve it. Brett's supervised visits continued every week. Sandra reported that he was getting better at reading Haley's cues and responding to what she needed instead of what he wanted. He brought toys she actually liked instead of random stuff. He learned her favorite songs and started singing them with her. Haley stopped crying when she saw him. She'd run to the toy box and bring him things to play with. She still called him Brett, though, not Daddy. Sandra said that was completely normal and would change when Haley was ready. Trust took time to build, especially for a kid who'd never known him before. The inheritance check arrived on a Tuesday morning. I stared at the number. $80,000 after taxes and legal fees. 40% of $200,000. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. I took a photo of it before depositing it through my phone, like I needed proof this was real. The next day, I met with a financial advisor Lydia recommended, a woman who specialized in helping single parents build security. We set up a college fund for Haley that would grow over the next 16 years. Put money aside for emergencies, car repairs, medical bills, all the things that used to terrify me. Created a savings account I wouldn't touch except for real needs. For the first time ever, I had a safety net. I could breathe without worrying that one bad week would destroy everything. Kaya came over for dinner that Friday. While Haley played with her blocks, Kaya mentioned that one of her co-workers had been asking about me. A single dad with a daughter around Haley's age. He'd seen me at pickup once and wanted to know if I was seeing anyone. Kaya showed me his social media, just casual pictures of him with his kid at the park. Nothing weird. I told her I wasn't ready yet. Dating felt like something from another lifetime, back when I believed people meant what they said. But knowing someone was interested felt good in a strange way. Like maybe someday I could trust someone again. Not now, but eventually. Brett sent a message through the co-parenting app 6 weeks into supervised visits. He wanted to take Haley to the park alone, just the two of them. I read it twice, then denied the request. Typed out a response reminding him that the agreement required supervised visits for at least 3 months. It had only been 6 weeks. He needed to follow the schedule we'd agreed to. No shortcuts just because he was getting impatient. He responded an hour later asking if we could meet to talk about the visitation schedule. Said he wanted to discuss adjustments. I agreed, but only at a coffee shop with Lydia present. Made it clear this wasn't about him getting what he wanted faster. This was about Haley's welfare and making sure any changes were appropriate for her development. We set a time for the following Tuesday. At the coffee shop, Brett looked tired. He ordered a black coffee and sat across from me and Lydia. Started talking immediately, saying being a father was harder than he thought. He'd assumed it would be like playing with a kid for an hour then going home. Instead, he had to think about her needs constantly, pay attention to her moods, figure out what she wanted when she couldn't explain it. He said he understood now why I was being cautious. Asked what he needed to do to prove he was serious about being in Haley's life for the long term, not just when it was convenient. I looked at him for a long moment, told him the truth without sugarcoating it. I didn't know if I'd ever fully trust him after what he did. He'd abandoned me when I was pregnant and called me horrible things. He'd ignored his daughter for 2 years and only came back when he needed something. But I was willing to let him build a relationship with Haley if he consistently showed up and put her needs first. Actions mattered more than words. He'd have to prove himself over time, not with promises, but with reliability. Brett nodded slowly. Said he'd been going to therapy too, working through why he ran away when things got hard. His therapist helped him see that he'd been selfish and scared, afraid of responsibility, afraid of being tied down, afraid of not being the center of attention anymore. He admitted he'd hurt me and Haley in ways he couldn't take back. Said he was trying to become someone Haley could be proud of eventually, even if that took years. I didn't forgive him. I told him that straight up at the coffee shop while Lydia sat next to me taking notes. Forgiveness wasn't part of this deal and never would be. He could be Haley's father if he proved himself, but we weren't going to be friends. We weren't going to have nice conversations about our days or share parenting jokes. We were two people connected only by a kid, and that's all we'd ever be. Brett looked like I'd slapped him, but he nodded slowly. Said he understood and would respect that boundary. I didn't believe him yet, but at least he was saying the right words for once. The next 3 months went by faster than I expected. Brett showed up for every single visit at the family center. Never late, never making excuses. The supervisor called me after the 12th week and said Brett had completed all his parenting classes with good marks. She'd watched him with Haley through the observation window and saw real improvement. He was learning how to read her signals, how to play at her level, how to be patient when she got fussy. The supervisor recommended moving to unsupervised visits in public places with me staying close by. I agreed but made it clear I'd be watching from wherever he took her. The park was busy on Saturday morning when Brett picked Haley up from my apartment. I followed in my car and parked where I could see the playground. Sat on a bench with my phone in my hand, ready to run over if anything seemed wrong. Brett carried Haley to the swings and set her in the baby seat, pushing her gently while she kicked her legs and laughed. He caught her at the bottom of the slide when she came down, making sure she landed safely in his arms. Watching him interact with her stirred up feelings I didn't want to deal with. Anger at all the moments like this he'd missed by choice. Sadness for Haley growing up without knowing her father for 2 years. But also this tiny bit of hope that maybe he was actually changing into someone who could be a decent parent. I hated that hope because trusting Brett again felt dangerous. Brett's mom started coming around more often after that. She asked if she could babysit Haley one afternoon a week, and I said yes after thinking about it for a few days. She showed up on time, brought age-appropriate toys, and genuinely seemed interested in getting to know her granddaughter. One evening while Haley played with blocks on the floor, Brett's mom sat at my kitchen table and apologized again. Said she'd spent years making excuses for Brett's bad behavior instead of holding him responsible. She'd blamed me for his leaving because it was easier than admitting her son was selfish and cruel. Watching him try to be a better father now made her see how much damage she'd done by enabling him. I thanked her for the apology and told her I appreciated her effort with Haley. We'd never be close, but at least she was trying to make up for lost time. My boss called me into her office on a Wednesday morning and I thought I was in trouble for something. Instead, she offered me a promotion to team lead with a big raise and better benefits. Said she'd been watching how I handled everything over the past year while keeping my work quality high. She saw leadership potential in me and wanted to give me more responsibility. I accepted immediately and called Kaya from the parking lot to tell her the good news. The extra money meant I could finally stop worrying about every unexpected expense, could start planning for Haley's future instead of just surviving week to week. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I looked around my apartment and realized how different everything felt. I had money in savings, full custody of Haley, a support system that actually helped instead of judged, and peace in my own home. Brett couldn't just show up anymore or eat my food or complain about my kid. The locks were changed. His name was off the lease and he only saw Haley during scheduled times. I'd gone from terrified single mom being threatened by her ex to someone who'd built a stable life through sheer determination. Brett hadn't ruined me like he'd tried to. I'd rebuilt everything stronger than before. Haley started calling Brett by a name on her own without anyone teaching her. She'd point at him during visits and say Daddy Brett, which the child psychologist told me was normal. It showed she was putting him into her understanding of family as someone separate from me but still connected to her. I was okay with it because Haley knew I was her main parent. I was the one who fed her breakfast, took her to daycare, read her bedtime stories, and comforted her when she had nightmares. Brett was someone who visited sometimes and played with her at the park. That was enough for now. Brett sent a message through the co-parenting app asking if he could have Haley at his new apartment for a few hours. He decorated a small bedroom for her with a toddler bed and toys. I told him I needed to see the apartment first before agreeing to anything. He gave me the address and I showed up the next day while he was at work, using the key he'd left with his building manager. I checked every room for safety issues, made sure the outlets had covers, looked for anything dangerous she could reach. The apartment was clean and the bedroom he'd set up actually looked nice. I took photos and agreed to a trial visit with my phone on and ready to pick her up immediately if needed. The visit went fine. Brett brought Haley back at exactly the time we'd agreed on, and she came running to me talking about the toys Daddy Brett had and the mac and cheese he'd made for lunch. She seemed happy and not upset at all. I checked her over carefully for any signs of problems, but she was just a normal kid excited about new toys. I realized that as much as I hated what Brett had done to me, Haley deserved to have a relationship with her father if he was going to show up consistently and keep her safe. My feelings about him didn't matter as much as what was best for her. That night after Haley went to bed, I sat with her in her room and had a conversation about families. Kept it simple because she was only 2, but I wanted her to understand in an age-appropriate way. Told her that Mommy and Daddy Brett didn't live together, but we both loved her very much. Families came in different shapes and that was okay. Some kids had parents who lived together, some had parents who lived apart, and all of those families were good as long as the kid was loved and safe. Haley listened and then asked if she could have more juice. She accepted everything easily because it was all she'd ever known. She didn't remember a time when Brett lived with us because he'd left before she was born. This was just normal life to her. Over the next few months, Brett's payments showed up like clockwork in my account. He never missed the 15th of the month, and sometimes he'd add extra with a note in the co-parenting app saying it was for Haley's daycare or new shoes she needed. I didn't thank him because this was what he should have been doing all along, but I noticed the consistency. Owen called Lydia one afternoon and told her that Brett was working with a therapist to understand why he'd run away from his responsibilities. Owen said Brett knew he could never fix what he'd broken, but he was trying to be the father Haley deserved now instead of the one who'd abandoned her. I told Lydia I didn't need to hear about Brett's therapy journey, but part of me was glad he was at least trying instead of just going through the motions to keep his visitation rights. Kaya invited me to coffee one Saturday morning and brought along someone she wanted me to meet. His name was Noah and he had a daughter named Sophie who was 3, just a year older than Haley. We talked about the chaos of raising toddlers and the exhaustion of single parenting, and he didn't push when I kept the conversation light and avoided talking about Brett. Noah asked if I wanted to get coffee again the next week and I said yes, but told him I needed to take things really slowly. He nodded and said he understood completely, that he'd been through his own divorce and knew what it felt like to be cautious about trusting someone new. When I introduced him to Haley a month later at a park playdate with Sophie, she immediately wanted to play on the swings with the other little girl. Watching them laugh together while Noah and I sat on a bench nearby, I realized I could actually imagine a future that included partnership instead of just surviving alone. A year after Brett had shown up at my door with his duffel bag expecting to move back in, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at my bank account. I had savings that would cover 6 months of expenses if something went wrong. I had a promotion at work that came with better pay and actual career growth potential. I had a co-parenting arrangement with Brett that was stable and consistent, even if our relationship would never be friendly. Haley was thriving in her new daycare and had friends she talked about constantly. Noah and I were dating seriously now, taking our time but building something real. Brett hadn't ruined my life the way he'd tried to. I'd rebuilt everything he'd destroyed and made it stronger than it had been before. Haley played with her blocks in the living room, building towers and knocking them down while laughing at the crash. I watched her and thought about everything that had happened since Brett walked out calling me a worthless incubator. His abandonment had been the most painful thing I'd ever experienced, but it had also taught me that I was capable of anything when I needed to be. I'd protected my daughter when no one else would. I'd stood up for myself when his family tried to shame me. I'd created a stable, happy life through my own strength and determination. That was something Brett could never take away from me, no matter what happened in the future. And it was something Haley would learn from as she grew up, watching her mother handle hard things with courage instead of giving up. She'd know that being strong didn't mean never being scared or hurt. It meant pushing through anyway and building something better on the other side.